This program is rated PG. It contains themes and scenes which may not be suitable for very young audiences. Parental guidance is advised.
Be advised that the views and opinions of the hosts and guests do not reflect those of the station.
Okay. Buha na, no? Iyon po artikulo ng isa sa ating panauhin, si Professor Lucio Pitlo III, who's with us now. He has been with us once before when he arrived from China after a year or two of studies in China. A year, no? Manila-Acapulco Galleon Trade and Maritime Silk Road, Parallels and Nexus. And the other article is the National Security Review of Foreign Investments comparing China and the U.S., which is very relevant to our discussion now with President Xi Jinping's visit to the U.S., Seattle, Washington, New York, and the earth-shaking developments in that visit, no, na pag-uusapan natin. And with Mr. Hiro VAswani, we'll be analyzing the Philippines in the context of this 21st century tectonic events that will be changing the topography of global geo and economic politics, di ba? So, ang problema dito naman sa Pilipinas, ito po ang issue ni paki-focus nga dito ulit. Ito naman ang issue nitong ating namumuno daw sa bayan natin. Anong sabi niya? People can read the headline. Yun, Aquino pokes fun at Beijing's South China Sea claims and praises Japan. Praising Japan, Shinzo Abe, whose population, 70%, opposes what he is doing. And yung economic program ng Japan of fiscal incentives, devaluation by 35%, isn't working. So, importante po ang pag-uusapan natin ngayon with our professor from DLSU University and our regular financial analyst. But let's start with your impression, Professor Pitlo. Dito sa visit ni President Xi sa U.S., anong significance sa tingin mo dito?
Sa palagay ko, no, malaki ang significance itong visit na to. Marami kasing issues na mapag-usapan between US and China. Among them would be climate change. They're negotiating for a bilateral investment treaty. The issue of the South China Sea will also be discussed. And then the issue about cybersecurity, cyber theft. There are a lot of allegations coming from US companies that their intellectual property are being stolen. And a lot of them are being traced to Chinese sources.
Let me just check the audio. Malinaw na malinaw ba? Kasi medyo nako-cover ng shirt niya yung mic. Is that okay? Okay, no? Okay. Importante kasi yung marinig natin yung mga analysis ni Professor Pitlo. What strikes me and a lot of people is that ang mga kontratang pinipirmahan at yung mga expectations ng US business sector in its relation with China is huge ang expectations nila. Ang kontratang pinirmahan ngayon sa Boeing is 300 units, and in the next 20 years they expect 6,300 planes. What are the other contracts that you're aware of that they're signing?
So first stop ni President Xi is sa Seattle.
Seattle, puro negosyo doon.
Washington.
No?
This is a state in the US which is very important, not only for aviation, being the headquarters of Boeing. It's also the headquarters of Facebook, and Mark Zuckerberg had an audience with President Xi, And he spoke in good Mandarin.
In Mandarin, si Zuckerberg.
There were suggestions that perhaps he had intimated to President Xi that he would like to have Facebook, a footprint in the 600 million internet users, potential Facebook users in China.
Potential,
So,
yeah.
Perhaps it could be...
Is Facebook blocked now in China?
Parang,
Parang, no? Google, Facebook, Google, Facebook, ano pang block doon? Twitter, YouTube. Kasi when I go to China, I literally cannot communicate with the Philippines.
They have their own version.
Yahoo, medyo pwede pa. Ang Yahoo, ano?
Yahoo, yes.
Yahoo, no?
You can access,
And ang talagang ginagamit WeChat, Weibo. Ano
they have their own
Baidu.
Baidu.
Okay, so before I go to Hiro, so what do you think this makes of the Philippine policy today, this engagement of China and the U.S.?
What we can see is that U.S. and China, these are major states, major powers. And while there are a lot of areas where they compete, there are also a lot of areas where if they would have to cooperate, it would be for the good of them and also for the good of the world, like climate change and issues about cybersecurity and so on. So for us, if the U.S. itself, a major power, competes and at the same time cooperates with China, then I think it's also important for us to also reconsider. While we have some disputes on territorial and maritime areas in West Philippine Sea, that should not prevent us from engaging China, perhaps in the aspect of trade, investment, economics. So it should not be a zero-sum game.
Well, regarding the cybersecurity issue, I think it goes both ways. I mean, the U.S. NSA, National Security Agency, and so on, is probably 10, 20, who knows, 100 times more active in cyber spying than any country in the world.
If you take the word of Edward Snowden, yes.
Yes. Yung whistleblower ng NSA. Okay, we'll get back to the other issues and your two articles here, because this national security issue with regards to the trade, is relevant given the attitude of the Philippine government with China, and later on the AIIB. Why are we distancing from it when the rest of the world is engaged with the AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank? Earlier, we were talking while we were preparing for the show with Hiro, and he's saying that China will be the dominant power. Why do you say so? It's not going to be the U.S. anymore?
Depends on how you calculate economic strength and power. China has not yet finished its development process. A lot of the Chinese people are still living in poverty. Let's not forget it. And they haven't finished that development track. However, China, because of the conditions in the global economy, has to make an important turn, meaning that the export-led era of development is over. They have to develop within. That means that there has to be a massive change in the system and structure that they have built over the last 20, 30 years. And that is what is causing now these changes in the world, where we see all across the world in the financial markets, commodity markets, everything is headed south. We are experiencing low oil prices because China has made that shift, together with the slowdown in the highly industrialized economies. This major change basically will affect and has affected the world in a great way. However, we see that the Chinese model of economic nationalism, where they actually develop their own type of businesses that apes or copies the West. Like you mentioned earlier, there is no Google, there is no Facebook, there is no other powerhouse internet companies in China, because they develop their own. They don't have an Amazon in China, but they have an Alibaba, which is far bigger than Amazon in the US. So essentially, they are still hewing to that model, that economic model of economic nationalism, meaning they develop their own in all the different sectors of their economy. And plus, they still maintain a closed financial system, which has propelled them further and faster than any other economy in the last 200 years. So all these facets of the Chinese economy and the Chinese political system are now creating problems for the West. And the US has got to accept the fact that they have to live with this system. And the Chinese are giving them basically parts of their economy which they still haven't developed.
In other words, one can say that, of course, there is the competitive aspect, if not the hegemonic aspect of the US ruling elite, the neocons and so on. But this, as you were saying earlier, the Republicans are in a quandary on how to react to Xi Jinping's visit because everything is friendly. Trade is good. What can they say to a China that is not exhibiting any hostility? Except in the 70th Victory Parade, they showed what they can do to anybody who tries to assault the security of China. So, in that context, let me go back to Professor Pitlo. So, do you think this visit represents a victory without fighting the war for China? E di ba si Sun Chun, sabi niya, winning the war without fighting. And I think that is one of the strategies of China. Put up a credible defense that anybody who tries to threaten will really get hurt and clobbered. But at the same time, extreme friendliness in the offers for business and so on. Plus, maybe you can also help us understand yung One Belt, One Road. Isn't this also part of the soft power or economic outreach of China?
I think right now it's still too premature to say whether there would be major breakthroughs in Xi's state visit to U.S. There are a lot of pressing issues that needs to be discussed. We are not so sure if all of them would be covered, considering the limitation in terms of time. But China, I think, is making headway in terms of advancing its soft power with this One Belt, One Road initiative, with this Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. It appears that to many, China represents a challenge to Bretton Woods institutions, I mean, World Bank, IMF, as well as ADB. But at the same time, I think China wants these initiatives not to be seen as too Sino-centric and too exclusivist. They even invited Japan and even the U.S. to join AIB.
Yeah.
So I think in that aspect, they're trying to say that this is open for all. This is a win-win cooperation. Now the details, again, remains to be discussed. A lot of the details has yet to be finalized. So I think the hesitation on some of the potential member countries to join has something to do with the fact that most of the details until now remain sketchy.
There I understand, around over 60 members now of the AIIB.
Yeah,
over 60 members.
close.
If the UN has 100, how many now? 190 members bang, United Nations? Ilan na ba? Well, anyway, so it's not yet the majority of the UN. But a lot of the countries in the UN are small countries like Burkina Faso and so on. But in my last visit to some of the think tanks in China, they get exasperated with this when discussing with Filipinos in particular, where 90% or 95% of the time will be over the West Philippine Sea, China Sea, when they say the AIIB and the economic prospects are so much larger and more promising than this limited issue. Is it really limited to the rest of the world and to Americans? Itong China Sea issue, West Philippine Sea issue? It is not as significant as some Filipinos would like to think.
Well, to many Filipinos, it is West Philippines is major issue because it's not only about maritime rights. It's also about territory, about livelihood of the people, especially fishermen affected. But at the same time, we have to recognize that the breadth and the depth of our relations with China, and even before these disputes became hot, for centuries, even before the Westerners came here, before the Europeans arrived here, we had a long history of commerce and trade with China.
Have you been able to visit the tomb of the Sultan of Sulu?
Unfortunately, no. I wasn't able.
Where did you study? In Beijing, or what province did you study when you were
Beijing?
In Beijing, so you were not able to visit Shandong. Of course, we'll get back to the West Philippine Sea issue and the China Sea issue. But what are we missing in overemphasizing this aspect? Of course, question of territory, they're under dispute. Question of economics. Wouldn't it have been better if the dialogue went on, and while the dispute over territorial issues are being tackled, the fisheries agreements are being discussed and signed? Because you can have a sharing of the maritime resources while the territorial questions are pending or under discussion. What do you think?
Yeah, well, there are a lot of models now, existing models for joint development, fisheries, even for oil and gas. But at the same time, I think it's also a political decision. Prioritizing a certain aspect of the relations over the others, I think it's a judgment call of the leadership. And at the same time, I think there are efforts from both sides to try to discuss this dispute, settle it in a peaceful way. Unfortunately, some of the measures, at least from the Philippine side, the belief was that they were exhausted. And that the only last relief left will be to initiate the arbitration challenge, because we tried multilateral, we tried bilateral, but we were not able to resolve the issue.
But it doesn't help that a president of a republic make comments like this, calling China Nazi and so on. Is that at all part of any serious diplomatic strategy, di ba?
Well, there may be a wisdom behind the strategy of the president to say those things, but I think it's still better to find alternative means of trying to resolve this dispute without fanning the fire, the tension.
Okay, yeah. I'll ask Hiro what his reactions are to these points made.
Well, if you look at the position of our president, the Philippine government per se, the government had no choice but to file that arbitration proceedings because we do not have resources or the capacity, essentially, to patrol and defend those areas under dispute. So it became unahan. Unfortunately, our military resources, logistics-wise and all, left it open basically for not only China, but Malaysia, Vietnam, Taiwan, basically to take advantage of our weakness. But that weakness is a result of basically our weak economy, our weak state, etc. It's a long story, but that put us in a no-win situation. So what would you do? You go to the multilateral institution and you bring attention basically to the world that there is this dispute ongoing. But the UNCLOS and the arbitration issue and all is not the hard fact of international law, because even the U.S. hasn't joined UNCLOS for many reasons, and the Chinese have not signed on to all the articles of that agreement in the UN. So whether or not the Chinese will follow what happens in that arbitration proceedings.
Well, it's very clear they will not follow.
They will not.
They've already declared that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And essentially, And that leaves us in a very, very bad position. What do we do?
Yeah. Well, let me put it this way. Given the evolution events now and with the engagement of China and the U.S. Coming to the fore, although this is a continuing evolving situation, it tends to show that things will be chummy between the U.S. and China in the coming years. And that would mean that the strategy taken by the present administration, which many hope will change in the next administration, has been really flawed and maybe even seriously damaging to future relations, including this latest comment, which the Global Times, one Global Times editorial or observer comment said, this is uselessly damaging future relations of China when this administration is about to be over.
May I add this? The move of China to establish a similar infrastructure investment group, the AIIB, is symptomatic of the fact that the world financial system, the world payment system for trade is broken. And there have been attempts in the past, basically, to move to adjust it to the new realities of the globe. And China is left with no choice, together with some of its allied countries, but to try to break ground to a new path. But I think that will lead to a worldwide system, maybe under the UN, to change the international payment system that has favored one country.
Okay.
And
the
that
US.
is the US.
Yeah. Okay, we have our last 2-3 minutes, so let me also try to simplify the discussion. Our subject is China-U.S. engagement. In a scale of 1 to 10, is this engagement now positively over 6, 7, 8, or is it still just at 3, 4, 5, if 10 is the highest level of friendliness and engagement of the U.S. and China?
I cannot give you an exact hard and fast answer to that. I wish I could.
Yeah.
Because as I said earlier, they compete, and at the same time they cooperate.
Where's the competition?
They compete in terms of leadership in Asia Pacific, in terms of military capacity, but at the same time, in terms of trade,
so
they are very interdependent.
We can safely put it at 5. Nasa gitna.
Half-half. Yeah,
Sige, ikaw, Hiro, we have 1 minute to go.
4 to 5. But the changes in the Middle East with the Vienna Convention meetings over and Iran being brought back into mainstream trade bodes well for the development of the Eurasian landmass. China has no choice but to head west towards Europe.
And can it be safely said that the world also will head towards Asia in this century? Because that seems to be happening, trade and
I think it already has.
It already has. So.
I mean, the energy resources are in the Middle East, which is part of Asia. The largest population centers, India, China, and the rest of the Middle East, heading towards Europe.
I will ask for the last advice from the professor from De La Salle University. What do you advise that people and the next government to do with regards to these relations with China and the rest of the world?
Recently, China lifted the travel advisory to the Philippines. So chartered flights are back. So I think it's a way of, it could be a way of signaling its intention to establish good relations in the run-up to maybe the elections for the next leadership of this country.
Will Xi Jingping be arriving for the APEC Leaders Conference here?
I think it's in the interest of China to come.
Yes.
It will be a major blow if the second largest economy in the world will not participate.
But why did Noy add this just weeks before that is about to happen? Well, we'll leave that for our next discussion when we do have the APEC meeting here. We'll invite both of you again so that we can update our assessment. Maraming salamat,
Okay.
Professor and Hiro, until our next discussion on this. Wait for the second half. We'll be discussing power, water, and the MRT, LRT again.